headlines at this hour. South Korean authorities, including the defense and foreign ministers, as well as relevant officials from the ruling party, have convened to warn North Korea against further provocation. The World Bank has cut its growth outlook for the global economy by almost a third to 2.9% for this year, citing Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the prolonged pandemic. And starting today, the 7-day quarantine requirement for unvaccinated travelers flying into South Korea will be lifted, while Incheon International Airport resumes its 24-hour operation. It's good to have you with us. You're watching the Daily Report for Wednesday afternoon, June 8th, here in South Korea. Relevant authorities here in the country came together early on this Wednesday to address security concerns on the peninsula amid North Korea's persistent provocations. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Bae Eun-ji starts us off.
North Korea has already conducted 18 missile launches so far this year. To discuss this matter and deterring further threats, the country's defense minister, foreign minister, as well as members from the ruling People Power Party met on Wednesday. During the meeting, the Conservative Party's floor leader emphasized that they're sending a message of warning to the North.
We're sending a clear warning. North Korea is not going to win anything through provocations. The only thing they're going to get is strong sanctions and punishment from the international community.
The country's second deputy national security advisor also vowed to take a tougher line against the North than the previous administration.
In case of provocation, we will clearly show them our capability and readiness. During the Yoon administration, we will find ways to fundamentally neutralize North Korean nuclear and missile threats.
Also during the meeting, the country's defense minister noted that the North on Sunday had fired several missiles simultaneously from different locations. He mentioned that in response to those threats, Seoul had responded by firing surface-to-surface missiles and had fully armed South Korean and U.S. fighter jets fly in formation as a show of force.
By firing surface-to-surface missiles jointly with the U.S. following the North's launch, our military shows the capability to accurately target the source of the North Korea's missile launches and their command and support centers.
He also stressed the seriousness of the situation on the Korean peninsula, with the North recently showing signs they're preparing for a nuclear test. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Right, and South Korea's first Vice Foreign Minister Cho Yeon-dong and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, as well as their Japanese counterpart Takeo Mori, have urged North Korea to refrain from acts of provocation that violate international law and undermine global peace and security. During talks here in Seoul on this Wednesday, they also called on Pyongyang to engage in talks aimed at denuclearizing the Korean peninsula, while sharing hopes for the regime to respond positively to international offers of COVID-19 assistance. Sherman, for her part, also reaffirmed Washington's commitment to regional defense here in this part of the world. Beyond the peninsula, the three officials addressed efforts to aid Ukraine and to promote a free and transparent Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. is holding its 9th biannual field training exercise in the Western Pacific Ocean. Dubbed Valiant Shield 22, the U.S.-only exercise comes amid heightened concerns over an impending nuclear test by North Korea. About 13,000 personnel from the U.S. Navy, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps and Space Force are taking part in the drill, as well as 15 surface ships and more than 200 aircraft. The large-scale combined exercise began on Monday and will run until June 17th. The training event allows U.S. forces across the Indo-Pacific to demonstrate their readiness to respond to any contingency, from humanitarian assistance to disaster relief to armed conflict. Meanwhile, top U.S. nuclear envoy Song Kim says North Korea's nuclear test preparations appear to have been completed. Accordingly, he has urged against further provocation and instead called for a diplomatic resolution to tensions on the peninsula. Our Kim Yo-sun has more.
Special U.S. representative for North Korea Song Kim warned that Pyongyang seems to have completed preparations for what will be its 7th nuclear test. Speaking during a telephone briefing on Tuesday, Kim also noted there is not a clear timetable for the possible test. He reiterated what other U.S. officials have already said, acknowledging that the regime had completed preparations at its nuclear test site in Punggye-ri. Kim highlighted that Washington hopes that the regime will refrain from conducting such a provocation, which could lead to serious uncertainties in the region. The U.S. envoy also emphasized that his country maintains close coordination with its allies and partners to respond to any provocation from North Korea in a swift and strong manner. Kim nevertheless had already stressed that the U.S. is open to a more comprehensive and flexible approach towards the North if it intends to find a diplomatic resolution to solve its nuclear issue. He explained how Washington had continued to reach out to the North for talks over the past year, adding that there was no response from the regime. Tensions on the Korean peninsula have been escalating, with Pyongyang exhibiting signs of a possible nuclear test, on top of the 18 missile tests conducted so far since the beginning of this year. Kim Hye-san, Arirang News.
In other news, prospects for the global economy this year are looking quite bleak, with the World Bank making a downward revision with regard to its growth outlook amid the prolonged pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our Ishihu reports.
The World Bank on Tuesday lowered its forecast for global growth to 2.9% and warned of risks of stagflation. According to the bank's Global Economic Prospects report, it has significantly decreased growth predictions from last year's 5.7% and January's 4.1%. The outlook for 2023 and 2024 is expected to be similar to the latest forecast. This comes as damage from the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has magnified the slowdown in the global economy.
Because of the war, we have a much larger menu of risks. And these risks, unfortunately, they mutually amplify each other.
The bank also said the global economy is entering what potentially may become a protracted period of feeble growth and elevated inflation, which raises the risk of stagflation, especially in middle and low-income economies. The report by the bank provides what it calls the first systematic comparison between the situation now to the period of steep stagflation in the 1970s. Current global economic conditions, according to the report, resemble what happened in the 1970s in that supply-side disturbances are fueling inflation. In the 1970s, accommodative monetary policy by advanced economies preceded stagflation, which mirrors steps taken by the world's leading economies today. However, unlike the 1970s, currently the dollar is strong and many developing economies now have clear mandates for price stability. To prevent history from repeating itself, the World Bank urged policymakers around the world to work to limit the harmful effects of the war in Ukraine, to fight the surge in oil and food prices, and set up debt relief for developing countries. 이시후, Arirang News.
South Korea's economy, for its part, marked a slight expansion during the first quarter of this year. Our Lee Ji-yoon has more on the central bank's findings.
0.6%. That's how much the South Korean economy grew in the first quarter of this year compared to 3 months earlier. While a positive number is good, it did miss the estimates the Bank of Korea had set at 0.7% in April. So why the slower than expected growth?
Private spending and investment in construction have gone down, but the manufacturing and service sectors saw a rise.
In fact, BOK data shows private consumption declined on quarter by 0.5 percentage point, while construction investment also went down by 3.9%. Exports, however, gained at 3.6%, while imports dropped 0.6%. The central bank also recently lowered its economic growth forecast for 2022 to 2.7%, down from the 3% growth projected 3 months earlier. However, the bank says it's not all bad news.
There is a possibility that exports could weaken as growth rates in major countries could slow down. But we expect eased antivirus restrictions and the extra budget to help in achieving the 2.7% growth forecast.
Meanwhile, South Korea's estimated gross national income per capita last year exceeded $35,000. This number is 10.5% higher than the year before. Lee Ji-yoon, Arirang News.
A team, including government officials from several ministries, has been set up assigned with the task of better aligning Korea's priorities with those of its partners under the new US-led Regional Economic Alliance. Our Min Soo-kyun explains.
South Korea has set up a pan-government response team for the recently launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, also known as IPEF. At a meeting on Tuesday, ministries including those of Finance, Trade and Foreign Affairs met to discuss ways to cooperate closely on the US-led economic initiative. This comes as South Korea seeks to play a leading role in the new pact. It also aims to actively take part in defining the economic framework that's centered around 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean energy, and lastly, tax and anti-corruption. The government says relevant ministries will work together as one team, but depending on the agenda, related ministries will lead the discussions alone. To maximize the benefits of joining the IPEF and to strengthen economic security, the government also plans to work with the country's private sector. A public-private strategy meeting and a consultative body for each of the 4 IPEF pillars will be implemented soon to help the government communicate closely with business groups. Last month, along with 13 others, South Korea joined the US-led IPEF to strengthen cooperation with regional partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
On that note, we end the first half of the Daily Report. In the second half, we address ongoing trilateral efforts among Seoul, Washington and Tokyo to address Pyongyang's provocations. Stay with us.
Arirang, what matters?
독립 어제 오늘 난 그날을 위한 기도 이 땅의 해방을 향한 하얼빈 앞에 내 방아쇠 이건 나의 민족과 조국을 위한
Welcome back. This past long weekend was quite eventful here on the Korean peninsula. North Korea on Sunday test-fired a series of short-range ballistic missiles in response to an earlier joint naval drill by South Korea and the US. For more, I have Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy joining this session virtually. Of course, Professor Kim, welcome back. I also have Professor Robert Kelly at the Pusan National University live on the line as well. Professor Kelly, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Kim, we'll start with you then. South Korea and the US launched 8 missiles of their own in the wee hours of Monday in response to a volley of 8 short-range ballistic missiles tested by North Korea Sunday morning, as I mentioned earlier. Now, more recently, Professor Kim, yesterday, the two countries staged an aerial exercise involving fighter jets. What are your thoughts on this response strategy, if I may?
I think South Korean government, along with the U.S. government, is now changing its military strategies. I think especially on the U.S. extended deterrence to South Korea. We have witnessed at the U.S.-South Korea summit meeting how two countries are trying to change the deterrence capabilities and deterrence tactics against North Korea. I think one of the important thing is to show a more timely and coordinated way of showing the extended deterrence capabilities. Before, whenever North Korea shot the missiles or tested nuclear weapons, what U.S. and South Korea did was pretty much after the event. After North Korea, did the military provocation, then two countries began to respond to those provocations. But I think this is kind of changing now. The U.S., based upon a very keen information capability, catches up a very exact timeline of North Korea's missile launches and also nuclear testing schedules. So I think now the U.S. and South Korea is trying to respond in a very timely manner, and even before the North Korea's provocation, they're very actively and proactively and preventively responding to North Korea's military provocations.
Right, and before we delve further into the response then, Professor Kelly, North Korea this past Sunday is believed to have set a single-day record for ballistic missile tests with a total of 8 launches over a span of 35 minutes. How do you explain this escalation in provocation?
Sure, I think that North Koreans have broadly sort of concluded in the last few years that there is no deterrence, there is no sort of conclusive package out there waiting. There is no détente. There is no sort of conclusive package out there waiting. Trump is gone. Moon Jae-in is gone. Right? We're sort of back to the status quo, which is sort of deterrence and containment, isolation and sanction of North Korea, which is more or less what we've been doing for several decades, bar those few years with Trump and Moon. And so the North Koreans are figuring, hey, what's the, why not keep testing, right? There is a sort of legitimate argument, I suppose, an engineering argument for testing, which is that the North Koreans increasingly rely on missiles, so they want to test them. But now you have a new president in both South Korea and the United States, right? And the North Koreans want to sort of remind us all that, they are an important nuclear power and they're not going to be bullied and everything else. I think part of that particularly is because of the way Yoon spoke, particularly when he sort of threatened preemption during the campaign. And the North Koreans traditionally respond pretty badly to that sort of thing and do tests like this. And so, here we are.
Right. Professor Kim, North Korea has engaged in testing its missile technology on 18 different occasions this year alone, as my colleague Bae Eun-ji mentioned earlier. How do you explain this frequency then in provocation?
I think, North Korea is now changing tactics. It's shooting very different missiles, new strategic missiles, and also it changed its nuclear, strategies. It clarified at the last month's parade that Kim Jong-un mentioned that, nuclear first use is possible. So I think that this is something based upon a very solid China-North Korea relations, I think. And I think North Korea is trying to show something more than, much more different than before. These kinds of new military strategy nullifies the South Korea's missile defense systems. And I think this is partly, because of the North Korea's domestic economic distress. It failed the 5-year recovery program and reinitiated another 5-year economic recovery program. So I think Kim Jong-un needs something much bigger and much stronger, policy, momentum compared to the past, which also is a very strong message to the United States and South Korea.
Right. And Professor Kelly, neighboring Japan and the US conducted a joint military exercise right after North Korea's missile launches this past Sunday. That being said, do you suppose these regional retaliatory measures will discourage further acts of provocation by North Korea?
Almost certainly not, but I think we should send the signal to the North Koreans that if they actually were to launch at South Korea or Japan, that we would be able to strike back at exactly the point of fire. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing now this emphasis on immediate counter launch. The idea is to establish a very short sort of fire, counter fire, sort of battery, counter battery relationship so that the North Koreans actually were to use one of these things, we would immediately strike back. That strikes me as wise, although I'm a little bit worried that it could actually sort of slide into a kind of tit for tat thing, right? The North Koreans launch and then we sort of say, well, we're going to launch back, and it kind of starts to spiral out of control. I would sort of caution about that a little bit. I think this is sort of part of the idea behind this is sort of, like I said, sort of President Yoon's sort of insistence on preemption from earlier this year. I think this is sort of designed to do that, right? To sort of show that if North Koreans actually do this stuff, look, we have the ability to immediately strike back. I think that's sort of part of a large, sorry, I didn't mean to go on here. I think it's part of a larger sort of problem for South Korea, which is increasingly that North Korea's sort of military threat to South Korea is missiles, right? You're seeing a missilization of the contest on the peninsula, and South Korea's options are pretty poor because missile defense doesn't work terribly well. And I think this is one of the reasons why Yoon was talking about preemption, and therefore we're seeing these sort of emphases on exercises and counterstrikes.
Right, we are. Professor Kim, despite its blatant violations of UN Security Council resolutions, North Korea is currently chairing the UN Disarmament Forum. That being said, how does that particular reality look to affect the credibility of this particular forum, do you think?
This is really a funny situation. North Korea is now chairing the Disarmament Forum from maybe May 30th to June 24th. So in the period in which North Korea is chairing this forum, North Korea is shooting the missiles and possibly nuclear test is possible. Maybe North Korea would think that it already possesses nuclear weapons and wants a armament, dialogue with disarmament dialogue with the United States together, thinking that the reality is different. Of course, the U.S. policy towards North Korea is that denuclearization of North Korea is the objective of North Korea policy, but of course, reality is that North Korea already possesses nuclear weapons. That's, I think, North Korea's position. But throughout the period, from when North Korea became a member of the United Nations, it began to develop nuclear weapons and tested nuclear weapons. So I don't think it's really in reality, it's very weird situation that North Korea, in the process of developing nuclear weapons and finally possessed nuclear weapons, but is now chairing a disarmament forum. This is really such a weird situation, I think.
Right, it really is. Professor Kelly, staying with the UN, the US efforts to impose stronger sanctions against North Korea within the framework of the UN Security Council were vetoed by China and Russia. Do you expect a similar standoff, even after a nuclear test perhaps by North Korea? And if that is the case, Professor Kelly, what do you propose to better deal with that situation?
Good one. I have no better solution to this than anybody else, which is why we're still talking about it after 70 years. I would be surprised if the Chinese and the Russians would support the sanctions. It was pretty tough for the Americans to sort of squeeze that out in the past, right? I mean, they've supported us on 9 previous ones. So I would be surprised if they were to do that again. I think the Chinese have made it fairly clear that they really want the Americans to make concessions towards North Korea in order to motivate some movement towards denuclearization. So I would be surprised. Even the nuclear test might cause a little bit of sort of shaking on this, but I would be surprised if it pushed them in that direction. I think so he asks sort of for my opinion. I think the real issue at the multilateral level is not so much more sanctions as it is really enforcement, right? There's actually, North Korea is actually fairly heavily cordoned off, right? Particularly since we started with sectoral, what we call sectoral sanctions on North Korea a few years back in late 2017. The real issue, I would argue, is to actually sort of enforce them. What we really got to do is get the Chinese and the Russians to actually help us to kick North Korean money out of their banks, for example. That would be a really big one, right? Or just patrol the EC, for example, to make sure that we can get photographs of the North Koreans doing ship-to-ship transfers. I mean, that's, I think, where we really need to sort of move. And I would imagine there might be some space after the nuclear test to sort of at least get the Chinese on board with that a little bit. Not the Russians, right? The Russians are out of the box on that for a while because of the Ukraine war, but perhaps the Chinese.
Right, hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Of course, Professor Kim, there is reportedly talk about the need to reactivate the General Security of Military Information Agreement between South Korea and Japan. First of all, do tell us a bit about this agreement and what are its prospects amid North Korea's recent provocations?
GSOMIA is a information sharing agreement between Japan and Korea. It applies to every country. And Japan, Korea signed an agreement of GSOMIA, which is to supplement each other's information capabilities. South Korea has much better information concerning North Korea and Korean Peninsula issues. So I think this definitely helps Japan to get ready to know what's going on in North Korea in case North Korea does any kinds of military provocations. But I don't think this is very easily revitalized because Japanese position about the historical issues is very firm now. Japan still thinks that, historical issues and forced labor issues, South Korea has to come up with a solution first, in order to solve this out. And South Korean government, especially previous government, Moon Jae-in government, initiated a two-track approach, which is that it tried to solve historical issues on one track and on the other track, still develop relations with Japan on other issues like security and North Korea and things like that. But even on that two-track approach, Japanese government's position is that that two-track approach is of South Korean government is to try to neglect any South Korean government's willingness to solve historical issues very actively. So that was also something that Japanese government has reservation about. So I don't think GSOMIA is there, but I don't think this is not easily revitalized. Maybe the U.S. is now focusing on trilateralism. That would be a very good momentum, but I don't think Japan-Korea relations, especially historical issues, is something in quagmire now. So I don't think other issues like GSOMIA and security-related bilateral relationship, I don't think that will be really easily solved. We have to find ways to
Right, I see. We really do. Professor Kelly, defense authorities and relevant officials are poised to meet in Singapore starting this coming Friday for the 19th Shangri-La dialogue. What do you suppose is the relevance of this platform, keeping in mind, of course, the change in international order amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which you mentioned, and, of course, North Korea's persistent provocations?
Sure. So the Shangri-La dialogue is always sort of developed, I think, from sort of fairly small beginnings and kind of like the big East Asian sort of security conference every year. I went to one a few years ago before COVID, and the big issue, of course, has always been Chinese participation, and it looks like this year Chinese participation is going to expand, which is the big thing, arguably. Again, I'm just sort of, it's just sort of out there in the media. We don't know yet. Shangri-La gives the Chinese an opportunity to sort of make an argument for sort of what an East Asian order ought to look like. It gives a place for the Americans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the other major players to sort of discuss these things, particularly regarding the South China Sea. I think that's really sort of the major flashpoint besides, of course, Taiwan. And there really isn't a way multilaterally to discuss that in East Asia, right? There have been sort of efforts to create sort of like other kinds of dialogues associated, for example, with the ASEAN, the ASEAN Regional Forum and things like that. And those haven't really worked terribly well. Shangri-La has hung on as sort of this big sort of high-profile thing. I think it helps that the Shangri-La dialogue is technically hosted by an NGO, by sort of a think tank, and it's not actually sort of American-driven or something like that. But traditionally, the Chinese have sent a low-level delegation because it was perceived as sort of anti-Chinese and Western and about containing China. maybe the coming one, it will be a little bit different. That strikes me as sort of the big breakthrough. I don't know if you'll see too much on North Korea, in part because I don't think North Korea is really going to change terribly much, right? I mean, I think North Korea is almost sort of passé. They're sort of locked in with nuclear weapons. They're not going to give them up. I think the bigger issue in Asia in the future is really Chinese behavior, particularly towards Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, what is your assessment of efforts by the Yoon Suk-yeol administration to set in motion perhaps a fresh chapter of constructive bilateral ties among Seoul, Washington and Tokyo? That would be trilateral ties, of course.
I think the trilateralism was very productive before Moon Jae-in government came in. Of course, during the Park Geun-hye government, there was some friction between Japan and Korea about the comfort woman issues. So ever since then, the trilateral relationship was not very much vitalized. But this is very good for the interests of South Korea. First, I think by the Biden's initiative, three countries definitely can be a very good partner about the economic security issues and global supply chain issues. We can share a lot of good, productive capabilities and some, original technology of the United States to form a global supply chain, which are win-win strategies, and also good for the how to deal with North Korea issues and also the regional security issues. So I think, finally, I think we are, back on the track about the trilateral, cooperation.
Right. Professor Kelly, the new administration here in South Korea has pledged to expand its presence in the international arena. Now, that being said, and beyond regional security concerns here on the Korean Peninsula, what more can be done to achieve this particular goal, do you think?
Sure, I actually think there's a lot South Korea could do. You may recall when Lee Myung-bak was president, there was a lot of talk about Korea as like a rising middle power and a responsible middle power and things like that. I think there are actually a lot of ways that South Korea could sort of pick up the ball on major issues, sort of like trade, for example. South Korea is very trade dependent, right? We know that South Korea is worried about China weaponizing interdependence, and that could be an area where where South Korea could show leadership. Climate change is an obvious one. Climate change is going to affect Asia, but it's not really just like everybody else, of course. And it's not really clear if there's sort of a leader on that issue in Asia. South Korea is actually pretty responsible on that, right? I mean, it's really, the big issue in Asia is Chinese emissions, but South Korea could show leadership on that. I mean, the whole host of sort of international issues out there where South Korea get involved, human rights or something like that, because North Korea's human rights situation, of course, is really terrible. And so there are many possible issues that South Korea could sort of pick up and run with. But I think the argument would need to be that South Korea would have to show some real sort of global governance kind of leadership, right? Some willingness to sort of make some sacrifices and sort of organize some multilateral cooperation or effort on some major issue and really sort of follow through. And I think, again, there was some promise for that under the Lee administration. Then it kind of seemed to sort of slide away. And I think the Yoon people are trying to sort of come back to that in part because I think they don't want South Korea to be sort of trapped just in sort of this tiny little space where all that matters is North Korea, right? Where South Korea's entire foreign policy is structured by behavior of the North. I think the Yoon people would like South Korea to have sort of wider strategic horizons, participate in more things, do more things. I'd like, for example, I think that's one of the reasons why the aircraft carrier has been an idea in the last, 6 months or something like that. All of that suggests that South Korea is sort of growing out of being locked into this one tiny little space. And I think that's why this is appealing. And it would be good too, right? I mean, South Korea is a liberal democracy and it'd be great if it did more.
Right, of course, to venture beyond this particular region. And having said that, one impromptu question perhaps for Professor Kim. Keeping that in mind, Professor Kim, what more do you suppose can the Yoon administration do to perhaps aid Ukraine in its fight against Russia, do you think?
At the summit meeting, South Korea and the United States agreed on a military military weapons, exchange program, which is called as a military FTA. I was just wondering what it is about. And clearly, it is about the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine in a shortage. So I think there are a lot of ways that United States need to get supplies, military weapons from other countries to be supported to the United States, so that the U.S. still can maintain its, weapon support to, level to Ukraine. So I think I'm not sure if South Korea can directly support weapons to the Ukraine, but I think, by way of the United States, I think that there is a clear, agreement between U.S. and South Korea that South Korea is still, supplying weapon system to Ukraine.
Right. And one final question, an impromptu one, of course, to Professor Kelly as well, going back to the situation here in the Korean Peninsula with regard to North Korea. Professor Kelly, when we talk about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, are we asking North Korea, what would be more feasible, that is? Asking North Korea to destroy all the nuclear weapons that it has already possessed, or perhaps asking them to stop making more nuclear weapons?
Well, it sure would be great if they would go to zero, but they're not going to, right? I don't think any analyst out there anymore really seriously believes the North Koreans are going to go to zero. I think one of the reasons why the Americans and South Koreans, Japanese, and others sort of hang on to CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. I think we sort of hang on to this language because it's been hanging around and nobody actually wants to be the president or the prime minister who admits that it hasn't worked. That's unfortunate because I think that keeps us latched onto a goal which is effectively impossible. We keep asking for the North Koreans to give up everything. They're not going to do it. I would like to see, and I've argued for this in my writing for many years, I would like to see the United States engage in a series of sort of small stepwise deals with the North Koreans to, as you just said, at least freeze them where they are, at least cap them so that the problem doesn't get worse. I think the big problem is that would actually require some fairly substantial concessions on our end, right? I mean, the North Koreans are conventionally very far behind the South and the United States. Missiles and nuclear weapons on top of those missiles are sort of their big strategic advantage now, and they're not going to give them up or slow down unless we give them something. And they're going to ask for a lot. They're going to ask for the closure of American bases in South Korea, for example. They're going to ask for the removal of American ground forces. They're going to ask for an enormous amount of money. We should be having these conversations, and I think one of the big missed opportunities of the Trump-Moon period is that we didn't actually talk about what kind of smaller deals we could maybe work out with North Korea, right? Instead, Moon and Trump sort of shot for the whole thing. They went for this sort of big bang deal that just wasn't achievable. And I think they missed an opportunity to go for sort of the smaller deal that you've mentioned, right, with some kind of cap in exchange for XYZ. And I feel like we missed a chance to really thrash that out. We didn't.
Right. Hopefully things will change under the Yoon administration then. Professor Kelly, thank you very much for your insights. And Professor Kim, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts as well.
Thank you for having me.
On the local pandemic front, the daily tally has rebounded to over 13,000 new COVID-19 cases on this Wednesday. But authorities point out the tally marks a fresh low for a Wednesday since late January. Accordingly, given the overall retreating trend, starting today, that is Wednesday, the quarantine requirement for unvaccinated travelers flying into South Korea has been lifted. Our Choi Min-jung was at the airport.
Until now, unvaccinated travelers to South Korea were required to quarantine for 7 days when arriving in the country. But starting Wednesday, this requirement has been dropped. Now, nobody is required to self-isolate regardless of their vaccination status. This also applies to unvaccinated travelers who entered South Korea before Wednesday and are currently under quarantine.
I'm really happy to think that I can now travel overseas. I'm currently making plans to travel abroad and so are my friends who aren't vaccinated.
This decision to lift the regulation was based on the number of infections becoming stable, as well as the easing of travel restrictions overseas. However, travelers are still required to test for COVID-19 twice, once before they fly to Korea and once after they arrive. And those who test positive upon arrival will still need to quarantine for 7 days. Also starting Wednesday, Incheon International Airport is officially operating 24 hours a day. After more than 2 years, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport has removed the 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. flight curfew hours. The number of incoming flights per hour has also been increased to pre-pandemic levels, from just 20 to now 40. More flights will also be available as the country looks to lift restrictions on the number of international flights in line with surging demand for overseas travel.
As a travel agency, we are delighted. Airfares have risen recently, but now with more routes available, we expect prices to drop, allowing more people to travel abroad.
Despite such moves to return life back to pre-pandemic times, authorities say they will remain vigilant with regards to inbound travelers as concerns grow over the spread of the monkeypox virus. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Right, and speaking about the monkeypox virus, health authorities here have designated monkeypox as a two-tier infectious disease. According to the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Agency on this Wednesday, the designation now requires anyone infected to be reported and placed in quarantine. Currently, 22 types of diseases are in the two-tier category, including COVID-19. South Korea has been seeking to send a probe to the moon for well over a decade, and just last May, the country joined NASA's Lunar Exploration Alliance. Well, this year, we're poised to launch into space our first mission, that is the Korea Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter. Shin Yen reports.
This year, South Korea will join one of humanity's greatest races ever, the space race. And it's all thanks to the KPLO, short for Korea Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter. In 2016, the Korea Aerospace Research Institute, also known as KOREA, started developing a spacecraft that has recently been named Danuri. It's a combination of two Korean words, 달 and nuri, short for moon and enjoy. The KPLO will travel to the moon by taking a boomerang-shaped trajectory. This flight method is known as BLT, Ballistic Lunar Transfer. Though it will travel farther than any other orbiter during past missions, it will maximize fuel economy because it moves using the gravitational force of the Sun, Moon, and Earth. And the KPLO aims to reach orbit 100 kilometers above the lunar surface by late December this year, from where it will conduct a range of studies. Data will be collected from the moon using 6 instruments on Danuri. One of them is the shadow cam provided by NASA, which will investigate what's known to be shadow regions of the moon to check for resources like water or ice. A pole cam and LUTI, short for Lunar Terrain Imager, will also be attached. This acts as Danuri's eyes on the moon, providing high-resolution images of the moon's surface. The magnetic strength of the moon will be measured using a KPLO magnometer, while a gamma-ray spectrometer will also be used to analyze lunar topography. Lastly, a DTNPL device. You can think of this as an internet communication device or space Wi-Fi. This will switch on. Now let's take a listen to what KOREA has to say are the determinants of success for the KPLO mission.
There are 3 key points that will determine whether the KPLO mission is successful. Firstly, whether Danuri separates from the rocket it's attached to at the exact position needed for the BLT method. Secondly, if Danuri can enter lunar orbit at an altitude of 100 kilometers by December 16th this year. It has to be punctual because if it's a bit late, it may collide with other countries' orbiters. Finally, we must be able to collect all the data we need using 6 of the instruments aboard Danuri.
Danuri hopes to carry out research until December 2023. This includes identifying potential landing sites for future lunar missions, as well as the search for usable resources on the moon. The Korea Aerospace Research Institute is going through its final checks before sending off Danuri to an Air Force base in Florida. Danuri will then blast off in early August aboard a Falcon 9 rocket made by SpaceX. If successful, Korea would be the 7th country in the world to reach the lunar orbit. Shin Yen, Arirang News.
Online clothing stores and related platforms have been witnessing a surge in shoppers in recent times. And taking note of this trend, a number of fashion services now offer their patrons the fun chance of trying on items virtually. My colleague Lee has more.
Fashion trends in South Korea change rapidly. There are also different ways to go clothes shopping here.
I'm out here in Shinsadong, one of the most famous spots for on-site shopping. You can window shop or even try on clothes at these different offline stores. But some say they prefer shopping from their homes.
I'm an office worker and don't have much time to actually go shopping, so I prefer online shopping. I like shopping online because I feel like there's more choice on the internet.
According to a report released by Statistics Korea, online shopping transactions rose almost 12% in April compared to the same period last year. Among them, fashion items accounted for 9.9% to over 1.6 trillion Korean won, or around 1.3 billion US dollars. This is an increase of more than 19% on year. South Korea has many e-commerce platforms, and it's not just the industry giants which are thriving. Many of the smaller companies try to reach customers through social media platforms like Instagram. One online shop owner says maintaining a social media presence is now a must.
I usually upload my daily outfits on social media to try and reach customers. Running these accounts contributes to high sales. People react more to short videos like Reels especially than just photos.
This is because shoppers now want more realistic pictures before they buy. And so some companies are even applying the latest technology to make online shopping more immersive, such as AR, which is being used to let potential customers try items on virtually.
People consider trying items on themselves important because they want to know what suits them best before they commit to making a purchase. AR is now used as a tool for an immersive online shopping experience. It's even adding fun to it.
He added customers can select from a lot more options than before with AR, as people can even try on items that are currently out of stock. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
A beloved South Korean television personality has passed away. According to authorities, Song-hye passed away at his home earlier on this Wednesday at the age of 95. Song hosted one of the most popular Korean TV programs, National Singing Contest, for more than 30 years, and he holds the Guinness World Record for the oldest TV music talent show host. Song's health had reportedly been deteriorating in recent times.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Following an attack on a Catholic church in southwest Nigeria on Sunday, the number of churchgoers killed has been updated to 38 people, including women and children. This comes as local authorities announced that 5 unidentified attackers carrying 3 undetonated explosives shot worshippers outside and inside St. Francis Catholic Church in the town of Owo in Nigeria's Ondo State. Investigations into a motive for the attack are underway. However, no arrests have been made. While such attacks are common in the north of Nigeria, Ondo is regarded as generally peaceful. Residents in the area told outlets on Tuesday that schools and public gathering spots remained closed, with many choosing to stay home. Brazil has deployed dozens of soldiers following the disappearance of a British journalist, Dom Phillips, and indigenous expert Bruno Pereira in a remote region of the Amazon jungle on Sunday. According to authorities, search teams in boats and helicopters have been sent to the Javari Valley. Brazilian police have opened a criminal probe amid reports that the pair had received death threats prior to their disappearance. Police have also interviewed at least 4 witnesses in connection with the case, adding that they couldn't rule out links to gangs operating in the lawless region. Now, struggling to find a charger may soon be a thing of the past for millions of European phone users, as the EU agreed on Tuesday to implement a uniform charging port for mobile phones, tablets and cameras. Only allowing USB-C compatible connections, the groundbreaking move is set to have a major impact on Apple, as the tech giant will have to change their signature Lightning ports and cables on all iPhones sold in Europe by 2024. The European Commission remarked that the measure aims to simplify consumers' lives while saving them money, after both Android and iPhone users complained of needing to switch chargers for their devices. After being looted and cut up in the 1960s, a pre-Hispanic Mayan frieze is now close to being fully restored. Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology has been working on the 8-meter wide and 2-meter tall frieze for the last 4 years and is now in the final restoration stage. According to researchers, the ancient artwork comes from a place called Placeres and dates back to between 450 and 600 BC. It was looted and moved to New York in 1968, where artwork traffickers broke it into 48 pieces. The fragments were returned to Mexico in 1969. Colombian naval officials monitoring the sunken Spanish galleon San Jose have discovered 2 more historical shipwrecks nearby. A remotely operated vehicle that had dived 900 meters underwater to provide new videos of the San Jose found a colonial boat and a schooner, both thought to be roughly 200 years old. President Ivan Duque announced the discovery on Monday. The San Jose galleon, which sank in 1708 near Colombia's Caribbean port of Cartagena, is believed to hold treasures worth billions of dollars. Images from the sunken galleon show gold ingots and coins, as well as cannons made in Seville in 1655 and an intact Chinese dinner service. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Wednesday afternoon. Skies are getting murkier across the country, and we're expecting to see some brief showers of about 5 to 40 millimeters, mostly in inland regions, including Seoul. It could also be blustery and thundery, as the bands of clouds can bring heavy and intense pockets of downpours. The amount of rain may vary, so please check your local weather forecast before heading out. Well, thanks to the rain, the air quality will remain good throughout the day, and that brings a halt to the above normal temperatures, with Seoul topping off at 26 degrees Celsius, which is slightly below the average. Temperatures are fluctuating these days like a roller coaster, so please be careful not to catch a cold. Well, tomorrow there's another round of showers in the forecast. Bring your umbrella with you until the day after tomorrow always. Then skies will brighten up from Friday, bringing a hot weekend that will hit 30 degrees in Seoul. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
Well, those are the headlines at this hour. Do stay tuned to Arirang News for more. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.